mouth breather in the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game, which is you're far more likely to have heard of this one than the last role-playing game I mentioned. D&D is the most popular one in the world, and still a niche hobby, but if you're into the niche hobby of role-playing games, you have pretty definitely heard of D&D, whereas Mage the Ascension is a niche role-playing game among people who are into niche role-playing games. Anyway, if you are into D&D, every edition of D&D, except for possibly the earliest ones, has had the concept of alignment in it. And in the early editions, the concept was I meant to introduce this subject a little differently. Let's back up. So in real life, I am not a big fan of the use of the terms good and evil, because I think that they're very loaded, very propagandistic ideas where, to use an extremely crude example, all through the Crusades, the Christians were saying the Muslims were evil, and the Muslims were saying the Christians were evil, and they used the idea of we're good and the other guy is evil as a justification for wholesale slaughter and warfare against people who were really not all that different from themselves, but just happened to be on the wrong side of an ideological line. So I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of labeling things as good and evil, but it's a hard habit to get out of. So naturally, I've backslid into doing this once in a while myself, and the reason that I wanted to bring D&D into it so in D&D, they originally actually didn't have a concept of good and evil in D&D, because originally D&D was a miniatures war game that kind of had the concept of role-playing slowly pasted onto it. And so the first time the concept of alignment came in, it was basically just they called it law versus chaos, and law was anybody that were the good guys, the player characters, who were fighting on the side of civilization against the hordes of orcs and goblins and ogres and trolls and God knows what else that were marauding out of the wilderness in order to destroy civilization for no particular reason. All of those were called the forces of chaos. And at the time, because it was this miniatures war game, that was really all they needed. You were playing the good guys who were trying to defend law and order and civilization against the hordes of chaos, and that was all anybody kind of needed. Eventually, from what I understand, there was a player who decided that he wanted to play a lawful evil character. He kind of came up with the concept of that, of being this kind of assassin or politician, I don't know too many of the details, where he was this character who was all about working within systems, working within the civilized world, but for very self-serving and treacherous ends. And so he was a lawful evil character, and that sort of introduced the concept that good and evil was a thing separate from law and chaos, and eventually D&D settled into the what has now come to be known as the alignment grid, which is basically pick one of law or chaos or neutral and one of good or evil or neutral. And so there are 9 possible alignments. And so if you are a staunch believer in right and wrong, Superman, Captain America type, then you come out as lawful good. If you're more of a Robin Hood type who works against the establishment of civilization for strong moral purposes, then you're chaotic good, and it goes from there. So why am I rambling on about all of this? Well, as I said, I'm not a big fan of the idea that you can label people as good or evil, and use that as justification for mistreating people that you've identified as evil. I'm not a fan of that. I am, however, in terms of the alignment good, I very strongly gravitate towards my version of the chaotic good archetype. Not Robin Hood per se, but that kind of thing. I am a strong believer that systems do more harm than good. One of the strong concepts that I associate with this is science fiction writer Jerry Pournelle came up with a concept that has come to be known as Pournelle's iron law of bureaucracy, which is dictating that any organization created for a purpose will eventually serve that purpose less and less over time and become more and more devoted to perpetuating its own existence. So you feed a charity about feeding the you found a charity about feeding the hungry, and the longer that charity exists and the more it tries to do its thing, it will always be about feeding the hungry, but it will do more and more things just to perpetuate its own existence, because all the people that work there like having the jobs and like having that particular job, and they want to perpetuate the agency for its own sake over time. And so I decided to do something different with my lights this time, and as you can see, it's not working super well. So, my point in bringing all this up, as I said, I identify with that chaotic good motivation where your desire to do good is not dependent on your obedience to systems. As I think I've made it pretty clear on this channel already, I am a strong opponent of the measures being taken in the name of preventing the spread of coronavirus. If you believe that the people who are doing that are good people, then they are lawful good people, and they are doing it in a lawful good way, and that's where the iron law of bureaucracy is becoming a problem. Even if the staff of hospitals are legitimately doing their best to heal the sick, they are doing it in an organized, bureaucratic fashion where their ability to do good is limited by laws that were ultimately created and put into place by people who are lawful evil or lawful neutral. Not good, people who do not have a moral center, people who, if they are not actively trying to exploit other people through the use of lawful systems, they are at least upholding the lawful systems for their own sake at the expense of individuals and at the expense of the greater good. They want to keep the system in place for its own sake because they just like having a system that they can work in. That's what they're comfortable with. And I don't consider that acceptable. I cleave very strongly to what I consider to be good morals. You could certainly make the argument that I am somewhat self-deluded in that, and that my version of good is not actually an accurate version of good. In that case, you could certainly make the argument that I'm more of a chaotic, neutral perspective. But in any event, I uphold the idea of chaos as being inherently good because of my strong aversion to these lawful systems and the extreme ease with which they can be corrupted, the inherent inertia involved in those systems, which causes them to self-perpetuate in the iron law kind of a fashion. And so I uphold the idea of chaos as being ultimate individual freedom, ultimate individual self-determination, everybody choosing for themselves what level of risk they're willing to undertake for themselves, and nobody has the right to take that decision away from you under any circumstances. If you're not comfortable with any level of risk, then it is entirely your responsibility to avoid those risks. And so so this is a strong moral objection I have. It's not just that I am too lazy to put on a mask and go out into society wearing a mask for the sake of supposedly protecting other people. It's that I don't believe that there is any protection offered to other people. I don't believe that the danger exists to the extent that we're being told it is. I don't agree with all of the messaging that the system is putting out there and trying to use as a way to control our behavior. And so I want people to uphold an individualistic vision of good, and I want everyone's freedoms to be preserved, even if it is at the cost of their life or the life of their loved ones or whatever. I think that there are much, much worse fates than death, and if I keep doing this channel long enough, I will eventually talk about that subject more. I am a strong believer that other cultures have a more sensible attitude towards death than Western civilization has, where they recognize that death is inevitable and they have cultural rituals in place to ensure that people die gracefully and accept the concept of their own impending death and don't try to go to unnatural lengths to preserve themselves indefinitely. That's a whole other video that's worth getting into at another time. For right now, I've kind of forgotten where I was going with this topic, so I will cut it off for now. This is another case of, like happened with my first couple of significant videos, the filthy lucre concept kept prolonging itself because I sort of forgot where I was going with this. That's the danger of having a totally unscripted and unedited channel. So I will continue my awkward ramblings at another time and hopefully remember exactly where I was going with this concept.